On the afternoon of April 19, 1775, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith led 700 British regulars back down the road from Concord toward Boston. Smith commanded some of the finest professional infantry in the world, trained, disciplined, armed with bayonets against farmers who barely knew how to hold a musket straight. Smith expected a tiring march home, nothing more. What Smith's column marched into instead was a 2-mile stretch of farmland that would bleed his men worse than anything at Lexington or Concord. A killing ground so brutal that British command would spend years making sure you never learned its name. So how did a scattering of untrained farmers in a town nobody remembers inflict more damage on the British Army than the 2 battles history actually gave credit to? To understand why this town became a slaughterhouse, you have to understand how badly the day had already gone for Britain before the column ever got there. Smith's mission had been simple on paper: march roughly 17 miles overnight from Boston, seize colonial gunpowder and weapons stockpiled at Concord, and return before anyone noticed. It failed almost immediately. Colonial writers, Paul Revere among them, had already spread the alarm through the countryside hours earlier. By the time Smith's men reached Concord, most of the powder and shot had already been moved and hidden by local militia, buried under floorboards and driven off in carts into the woods. Then came the fight at Concord's North Bridge, where colonial Minutemen stood their ground against British regulars and didn't break. British soldiers died there. British soldiers ran there. And by noon, Smith was ordering the retreat 18 miles back to Boston. His men already exhausted from a full night's march, a morning of failed searching, and an afternoon of combat. Every mile of that retreat made the situation worse, not better. Ammunition that had been adequate for a single skirmish at a bridge was not adequate for a running fight stretched across an entire afternoon. Discipline that held on a parade ground began fraying under continuous, unpredictable fire from men the British couldn't see, couldn't identify, and couldn't punish with a bayonet charge because there was never a line to charge into. And with every mile, more militia companies arrived. Word of the fighting at Concord had spread the same way the original alarm had, town to town, farm to farm, and by early afternoon, companies from Woburn, Dedham, Roxbury, and a dozen other towns were converging on the only road that led back to Boston. The British weren't marching away from danger, they were marching further into it, with a column that grew more strained and more desperate the longer it moved. This wasn't a victorious army marching back in triumph. It was 700 exhausted men walking into a countryside that had spent all morning arming itself, and it would only get worse from here. Consider the math Smith was working against. His men had been awake and moving since roughly 10 o'clock the night before, a night march of nearly 10 miles just to reach Lexington, followed by another 6 to Concord, a morning of searching houses and barns for hidden stores, a firefight at the bridge, and now an 18-mile walk home. All of it in wool uniforms, carrying full kit in weather that offered no relief. Fatigue alone was becoming as dangerous an enemy as the muskets in the tree line. A tired soldier reloads slower. A tired soldier misses the man ducking behind the wall 40 yards away. And every hour that column stayed on the road was another hour for word to spread to one more town, and one more company of armed men to find the road and take up a position along it. But the thing that actually broke the British column that afternoon wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a tactic. One the British had spent the entire war dismissing as beneath serious soldiering. The ambush from cover, fired by ordinary men who had never worn a uniform in their lives. Colonial militia doctrine hadn't been built in a war college. It had been built out of necessity, shaped by generations of colonial farmers who hunted for food, built their fences out of loose fieldstone, and knew every wall and tree line on their own land better than any map drawn in London ever could. British officers had watched colonial militia drill on village greens for years and considered it a joke. Amateur farmers playing soldier, standing in ragged lines that would collapse the instant real regulars leveled bayonets at them. European warfare in 1775 was built around massed formations facing each other across open fields, volleys traded at close range, discipline holding the line even as men fell beside you. Hiding behind a wall and shooting a man in the back was, to a professional officer's eye, barely soldiering at all. It was closer to poaching than to war. That contempt is exactly what let it work. Nobody in British command had planned for a countryside where every stone wall, every tree line, every farmhouse window could conceal a man with a loaded musket and a grievance he'd been nursing for years. The tactic had never been tested against a full British column in daylight, over open ground, stretched across 18 miles of road. It had been used in scattered, small-scale skirmishing before, dismissed by professional soldiers as harassment rather than warfare. April 19, 1775, was its trial by fire at scale, and Menotomy, a quiet farming village nobody had marked as a battlefield, is where it proved itself beyond argument. Somewhere in the ranks of exhausted militia converging on that road, an uncomfortable truth was already being understood that British command refused to accept. You did not need trained soldiers to destroy a professional army. You needed geography, patience, and a willingness to fire from cover instead of standing in a line to die with honor. The farmers of Middlesex County weren't fighting a battle in the European sense at all. They were running a gauntlet, and they had built it out of their own homes, their own fences, their own land. By roughly 2 o'clock that afternoon, Smith's column, now bleeding men and nearly out of ammunition, met salvation on the road near Lexington. Brigadier General Lord Hugh Percy's Relief Brigade, close to 1,000 fresh troops with 2 field cannon, sent out from Boston that morning specifically because Gage's command feared Smith's men might not make it back at all. Combined, the British force now numbered somewhere close to 1,700 or 1,800 men, more than double what had marched out the night before, and on paper, an overwhelming force against any resistance a handful of farming towns could offer. Percy was, by the standards of British officers that day, unusually sharp. He recognized immediately that simply marching his combined force back down the same road in the same tight column would only offer colonial marksmen a longer, denser target to fire into. So Percy made a decision that would define the rest of the day. He ordered flanking parties, small detachments of infantry pulled from the main body, to move off the main road on both sides of the column as it advanced, sweeping through farmhouses, outbuildings, barns, and high ground along the route. Their job was explicit: deny militia any position from which they could fire down into the marching column below. It was, on paper, sound infantry doctrine, the kind any competent European officer would have recognized and approved of. Protect your main body by denying the enemy the high ground and the cover around it. Clear before you advance. But the road into Menotomy ran directly through a working village. Homes, barns, a tavern, orchards, and stretches of fieldstone wall that had stood for generations. All of it now sitting squarely in the path of Percy's flanking sweep. All of it inhabited by families who had lived there their entire lives and had nowhere else to go. As the column entered Menotomy, those flanking parties began moving house to house with methodical, practiced efficiency. Doors were forced open. Outbuildings were searched room by room. Any position, a barn loft, a walled garden, a farmhouse window with a clear line down onto the road, was treated as a target to be cleared, not a home to be respected. Colonial militia, meanwhile, were doing exactly what the terrain invited them to do, using the stone walls lining nearly every field along the road as firing positions, loading, firing a single shot, and falling back to the next wall as the column advanced, never forming a line, never giving the British regulars the massed target their training was built to punish. It was a fight without a front, soldiers advancing down a road that seemed to fire at them from every direction at once, with no single point they could charge to make it stop. This is the moment the two tactical philosophies collided directly, at close range, with lethal consequences. British doctrine said, "Clear the ground, protect the column, advance in strength, and don't leave an enemy position at your back." Colonial method said, "Never stand still long enough to be cleared, and use every wall and doorway as one more second of delay." Where those two approaches intersected, inside actual buildings, at distances measured in feet rather than yards, with muskets that took nearly 20 seconds to reload between shots, the fighting stopped being a running skirmish along a road and became something closer to house-to-house combat, room to room, the deadliest form of engagement either side would face that entire day. Percy also brought his two field cannon into play as the column moved through, using them to scatter the largest concentrations of militia visible along the route, a tactic that worked well enough in open ground but did nothing to solve the problem hiding in every barn and cellar closer to the road. Cannon fire could clear a hillside, it couldn't clear a house. That gap between what the artillery could reach and what the flanking infantry had to reach on foot, room by room, is precisely where Menotomy's fighting turned as brutal as it did. The column could not simply walk past a threat it couldn't see, and it could not afford to stop and besiege every farmhouse along an 18-mile road. So flanking infantry did the only thing available to them under those conditions. They went in fast, assumed hostile intent from anyone still inside, and settled the matter at bayonet point, rather than risk taking fire from a position they'd already passed. Francis Smith himself had gone into this mission with the quiet confidence of a man who did not expect farmers to be a serious problem. He was, by most accounts of his fellow officers, a cautious and somewhat plodding commander, chosen for this assignment largely by seniority rather than any particular reputation for battlefield brilliance. The kind of officer whose men grumbled about his slowness even before the shooting started. British Command's private assessment of colonial militia throughout early 1775 had been openly dismissive. Men who drilled on village greens with old muskets, without officers of any real training, expected to scatter the moment professional infantry advanced with fixed bayonets. General Gage's own reports back to London in the months before the battle downplayed just how organized and how armed the countryside had become, treating the coming operation as a straightforward policing action, rather than what it actually was. A march into territory that had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment for over a year. That overconfidence didn't just belong to Smith. It ran through the whole British chain of command that spring. The assumption that colonial resistance, if it came at all, would be disorganized, brief, and easily brushed aside by disciplined regulars standing shoulder to shoulder. Nothing in that assumption accounted for a countryside that had decided not to fight the war the way Britain expected, using its own farmland, its walls, its barns, its windows, as a weapon nobody in London had budgeted for. Inside Menotomy, the fighting concentrated with brutal intensity around a handful of specific structures, and none more devastatingly than the home of a 58-year-old farmer named Jason Russell. Russell was lame, walking with visible difficulty, and by every account could have fled with his family when word came that the British column was approaching. Local tradition holds he refused, choosing instead to stand his ground on his own property rather than abandon it. As British flanking troops closed in on the house, Russell was shot down on or near his own doorstep. His body was reportedly bayoneted repeatedly afterward, by some accounts more than a dozen times. He and 11 other men were killed in and around his house that afternoon, by a wide margin, the single deadliest incident of the entire day. Deadlier than anything that happened at either Lexington Green or Concord's North Bridge, All of it inside the walls of one ordinary farmhouse. A few hundred yards away, a 78-year-old farmer and former militia officer named Samuel Whittemore made a decision even more extraordinary. Armed with a musket, at least one pistol, and a sword, Whittemore positioned himself alone behind a stone wall and opened fire on a passing British detachment, reportedly killing or wounding several soldiers before the detachment turned its full attention on him. He was shot in the face at close range, then clubbed with musket butts and bayoneted more than a dozen times, and left in the road for dead. He did not die that day. According to local tradition and town records, he lived for another 18 years, into his 90s, one of the strangest survival stories to come out of the entire war. Inside Cooper's Tavern, the fighting crossed a different line entirely. Two local men, Jason Winship and Jabez Wyman, were killed inside the tavern by British soldiers, reportedly while unarmed. Their deaths, remembered together in Menotomy's town history, are cited as among the clearest instances that day of soldiers killing men who were not fighting at all, a detail almost never mentioned alongside the more familiar names of the day. Nearby, in the chaos along the same stretch of road, a woman named Hannah Adams reportedly fled her own home with young children as fighting closed in around the property, a detail that survives mostly in local memory rather than national retelling, and a reminder that the danger that afternoon didn't stop at armed militia. It reached into houses where no one was carrying a weapon at all. The village itself gave the fighting its particular character. Menotomy wasn't open country, it was a working farm town, fields divided by loose fieldstone walls that had been stacked by hand over decades, orchards just beginning to bud in the April weather, a scattering of barns and outbuildings that gave a defender cover every few dozen yards. British regulars, dust-covered and soaked through with sweat after 18+ hours on their feet, were moving through terrain that offered concealment at almost every step, and they knew it. That knowledge is part of what made the flanking sweeps so aggressive. An officer whose men had already been shot at from a dozen unseen positions that day was not inclined to give a farmhouse the benefit of the doubt. Every one of these moments happened inside the mechanism Percy himself had set in motion that morning. His flanking infantry, sent house to house specifically to protect his column from ambush, is the exact tactic that put British soldiers inside Russell's home, inside Cooper's Tavern, at close quarters with men and in some cases civilians who had nowhere left to run. By the time the column finally cleared Menotomy and pushed on toward Charlestown, the town had recorded, by most accounts, the highest concentration of colonial deaths of any single location that day. By some tallies, close to 24 men killed in this one stretch of farmland alone, more than fell at Lexington and Concord's famous engagements combined. 12 of those deaths came from a single house. Across the entire 18-mile retreat, British losses for the day totaled somewhere near 73 killed, well over 100 wounded, and roughly 24 missing or captured. A casualty rate historians still find difficult to reconcile with the idea that this was a professional army retreating from farmers with no formal training at all. Colonial losses across the whole day numbered somewhere around 95. And a meaningful share of both totals happened not at the sites we remember, but inside a town most people watching this have never once heard named. A town that, on the numbers alone, may have been the single deadliest place in America that day. What happened at Menotomy didn't just add to a body count. It confirmed, in the most violent way possible, that a countryside fighting from cover could inflict real, sustained damage on professional European infantry, a lesson that shaped how colonial forces approached engagements for the rest of the war, moving further away from set-piece battles and further toward exactly the kind of dispersed, terrain-driven fighting that had just proven itself in Menotomy's fields and farmhouses. It's the same uncomfortable lesson a British army would relearn decades later, an ocean away, storming the breach at Badajoz in the Napoleonic Wars, where a tactically sound assault gave way to violence against civilians that popular memory of that otherwise celebrated campaign has always preferred to leave out. A necessary military decision and an atrocity, produced by the same order, is not unique to April 19, 1775. It just isn't a story either side likes to tell about itself, in any century. The lesson underneath all of it is a simple one, and it travels well beyond 1775. The side that looks unstoppable on paper is often most vulnerable to a fight it never trained for, and confidence, more often than any weapon, is what turns a retreat into a disaster. The Jason Russell House still stands today in Arlington, Massachusetts, preserved as a quiet historical site, its walls reportedly still marked by damage from that afternoon. Cars pass it every day without slowing down. Most of the people driving past have heard of Lexington. Most have heard of Concord. Almost none of them know that the bloodiest 2 hours of April 19, 1775 happened right here, in a town history quietly decided not to remember, on a road that looks, today, like nothing ever happened on it at all.